The Neptunia Rebirth trilogy for Switch has been exciting ever since EastAsiaSoft brought over the first game, and it boosted up to 60 FPS when played on the Switch too. It really makes it a downer that Nintendo said no to Idea Factory International bringing this to the West officially. But with the release date of 3 having just been shown off on EastAsiaSoft's website for Halloween, let's dive into the second game. Here is my Asia import review of Hyperdimension Neptunia Rebirth 2 Sisters Generation for the Nintendo Switch and backwards compatible with Nintendo Switch 2. In terms of story, Rebirth 2 is the true beginning of the Neptunia series. Retconning everything that happened in Rebirth 1, this game takes place in a new game industry, a single landmass containing all 4 nations of Planeptune, Lastation, Louis, and Leanbox. The story surrounds Nepgear, the CPU candidate little sister of series protagonist Neptune. When all of the main CPU goddesses that reside over the nations are defeated and imprisoned in the game industry graveyard, only Nepgear is freed and goes on a journey to recruit the other candidates in an attempt to free their big sisters and save the world from ASIC, a sinister organization trying to influence the younger generation not to buy video games but pirate them for free. As a story, this game's pretty good. It reboots Neptunia into a new timeline, but does a lot of work to build up the game's world. You spend a lot more time within each nation in this game with Nepgear and her friends, but you also have a lot of story development for recruitable side characters like Cave and the new redesign of Falcom. The main downside of the story is the repetition of the villains. It solidifies the green-haired underling as a villainous character that very quickly just turns into comic relief, but she keeps coming back for pretty much every conflict for the first 3/4 of the game. She works as a fun little comedic relief villain, but she's in the story far too long before the real villains are introduced. This is unfortunate because of what this game is. Rebirth 1 was a parody of the console wars, while Rebirth 2 is a parody of the handheld console wars of the late 2000s, with Nepgear based on the Sega Game Gear, ROM and RAM on the dual-screen Nintendo DS, and Uni on the PlayStation Portable. And like Rebirth 1 before it, this is the English dub version of Rebirth 2, having all the old voice actors for these roles. It also has the same gaps in English dub versus non-voiced scenes, but Rebirth 2 does have fewer non-dubbed scenes overall. It is a lot more balanced than Rebirth 1 was. When it comes to gameplay, this is a turn-based RPG with free roam elements. Just like with its predecessor, you travel through 3D dungeons and fight enemies in a meld between turn-based and free roam combat. To get things started, this version of Rebirth 2 for Switch includes almost all DLC that released for the PlayStation Vita. The Super EXP plans, a few characters from Rebirth 3 and Mega Dimension to your playable party, Nepgear's overpowered in-game DLC weapons are available from the get-go, and the extra dungeons and Coliseum fights. The only thing that was omitted was the Survival Mode DLC for the Coliseum, the same DLC they did not include in the Switch version of Rebirth 1. Main progression is identical to its predecessor. You have a 2D world map with the nations and dungeons for you to choose from, going through story events as they pop up and diving into dungeons for combat and boss fights. Rebirth 2 uses the same remake and plan system where you unlock plans from NPCs on the world map and can use materials to create features, equipment, new dungeons, and more. The new mechanic introduced here is Stella's Dungeon, a sort of simulator where you send the Stella character through an unlocked dungeon with her own equipment she picks up, and it runs on timers. When she succeeds, she comes back to get new equipment for herself and giving materials she finds to your inventory, helping to minimize grinding for materials when making plans. Most everything else is the same. Dungeons are 3D areas you explore with harvest points to get items from, and enemies you interact with on the map to spark a battle. The combat is the same from Rebirth 1, having a turn-based system where you can freely roam the arena on your turn to set up your combos and attacks. It's not really a bad thing as it's a very fun set of mechanics, but there's not really anything new to the combat system that wasn't already in Rebirth 1 outside of elements exclusive to this game, like playable characters, enemy variations, and a few dungeons that were not in Rebirth 1. and that brings up a lot of repetition with the assets. To explain, when Compile Heart took Hyperdimension Neptunia Victory's game engine and remade all 3 original games with it, a lot of assets became identical between the different games. Lots of dungeons are copy-paste the same dungeons as Rebirth 1. Like I said a moment ago, there are a few types of dungeons and enemies that are exclusive to Rebirth 2, but it will feel very similar, as is the nature of how Compile Heart did these remakes. But there are a couple things that set Rebirth 2 apart. First, it's a much less difficult game. Rebirth 1 was filled with gigantic difficulty spikes, encouraging you to constantly grind for levels or use the overpowered DLC characters to get through the story. Rebirth 2 is far more balanced, where you don't actually need to stop and grind all that much. The bosses can still be difficult, but there's not an overwhelming need to grind, and if you use the Super EXP plan that comes with the DLC, you'll never have to grind, as you'll always be far ahead level-wise than where you need to be. The other is replayability and endings. Rebirth 1 only had a normal and true ending, but Rebirth 2 has 9 different endings you can get for different criteria, like share levels from guild missions for the different nations, or seeing certain chirper events on the world map to be able to do the infamously dark Cursed Sword Conquest ending. This is what gives Rebirth 2 its replay value, as they're all interesting and fun endings to go into, and there are so many of them. That brings us to content and length. The story is a bit longer than the first game, so if you don't skip cutscenes, expect Rebirth 2 to be at least 30 hours for getting your first ending. I skipped all non-voiced scenes here since I've played the game before, and used the Super EXP plan, and I reached the end after around 15 hours total. Next up is presentation, which looks good for what it is. If you look closely at the models, they all look smooth as they did in Rebirth 1. You might be able to see a few small jagged edges or two if you really zoom in on them, but it just looks good, like the PS Vita version, but at a higher resolution and having far less jaggies. With performance, this is another big difference between Switch 1 and Switch 2. On Switch 1, it's playable enough and very similar to the old Vita release, but it's not a smooth experience. You will get lots of drops under 30 FPS in the majority of dungeons, especially the Ocean Resort variants. These dungeons have gigantic drops all over Switch 1, especially when you're in battle. It is certainly a playable game in this state, as it is a turn-based RPG, but it's not a pleasant experience. Swapping over to the Switch 2, we once again get a boost up to a wonderful 60 frames per second. You will still get little hiccups when first loading into dungeons, but it'll be far smoother and a better flowing game. It's not perfect though. Just like Rebirth 1, some cinematic animations will have the frame rate jump around like you're seeing here in Red's EXE drive, and the same animations that dropped a bit in the last game with the child version of IF are still here in Rebirth 2. I also noticed that the little hiccups that happen in dungeons happen more often in Rebirth 2. You'll be walking around and get little stutters here and there. Not anything that drops the frames under 30, but you'll notice it happening more in Rebirth 2 than Rebirth 1. It is a mostly 60 FPS game, but not perfectly. That brings us to battery life. Neptunia Rebirth 2 will give the original and light models a battery range of about 2 to 3 hours. The V2 and OLED models get 5 to 6 hours, and the Nintendo Switch 2 gets around 3 hours and 25 minutes. In conclusion, Neptunia Rebirth 2 has hit Switch in Asia with the English dub and a boost up to 60 FPS on Switch 2. Now, the downside, the game does feel a little repetitive in the reused assets and the villain part of the story, and the performance is pretty rough on the original Switch. But if you have a Switch 2, it's a charming and hilarious plotline with a ton of replayability and great parody of how the handheld console market was back for the DS and PSP. Reviews to Go rates Hyperdimension Neptunia Rebirth 2 for Nintendo Switch an 8 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.